The Telecommunications Act of 1996, landmark legislation passed by the 104th Congress and signed by President Bill Clinton, was intended to increase competition and ensure the growth of the internet without excess federal regulation. Several unintended consequences have emerged from the Act in the last 25 years, most notably Section 202 reforms that allowed the vertical consolidation of radio and television through mergers and acquisitions, leaving only a handful of media conglomerates today. Section 230, known as the Good Samaritan provision, immunizes internet companies from civil liability for the statements, utterances, and content of third parties. The language used in the legislation allows internet companies to remove offensive and extremely violent speech, but it also includes constitutionally protected speech without limits and without any recourse for the person whose rights may have been violated. I recommend congressional revision of the Act, especially the offending provisions of 202 and 230, as well as a return to the more activist role of the FCC to ensure that the broadcast and internet industries clearly define news programming from opinion, with minimum requirements and for purely news programs presented as a public service. In addition, any revision should be clearly defined and clearly define the nature of speech that can be regulated by the internet companies and should explicitly forbid the banning of political speech and non-violent, unpopular opinions. The significance of the Act is that in 1996, the Congress passed this law that completely upended the regulatory environment of the communications industry. It was, in fact, the first since 1934, by allowing telephone companies to enter video broadcasting, which was primarily the domain of the cable industry and broadcast TV stations. During the days of online bulletin boards and America Online chat rooms, the law created a regulatory framework where the business could grow without any excess federal regulation. At the same time, Republicans and conservative Democrats concerned about online pornography crafted Title V, known as the Communications Decency Act of 1996. It was ostensibly to promote self-regulation among internet content providers by giving them the ability to eliminate offensive sexual and excessively violent content. While portions of the act were struck down by the courts for overreaching into constitutionally protected speech, the good intentions of the CDA have been corrupted today to open the door for conglomerates like Facebook and Google and Twitter to self-regulate political opinion, act as arbiters of fact, and to silence unpopular political opinions, including those of a former president of the United States. The vertical integration in which websites, broadcast television stations, newspapers, radio stations, and television networks merge into an almost monolithic range of acceptable opinion, where the same 5 or 6 or 7 corporations have the ability to limit the marketplace of ideas on the most important topics of the day, whether they be elections, globalization, national interests versus international concerns, a worldwide health crisis. The past 5 years have made it apparent that the language of the 1996 Act that enables them to do this, especially in sections 202 and 230, have had wide-ranging and unintended consequences that have, instead of enhancing competition and free thought, have limited it. Instead of allowing free political and intellectual expression over the internet, corporations are now pressured by outspoken congressmen, radical activists, to stop unpopular opinions on both the left and the right, or even ideas that run counter to the corporate media's narrative from being promulgated online. Using tactics from the McCarthy era, government media interests align to charge that opinion A, for example, is the result of Russian disinformation, while opinion B, which is the view of the American intelligence community, is more acceptable. The same people who said there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. At the same time, the government media alignment, for whatever reasons, financial or otherwise, accepted the explanations of the Chinese Communist Party in regard to an event that brought the entire globe to a standstill. For primary and secondary sources, I was able to obtain an oral history with Stephen Hoffenberg, the former CEO of the New York Post, who played a major role in a drama that occurred in the late 1980s. Mr. Hoffenberg owned the New York Post for 3 months after Rupert Murdoch was forced to sell it because Senator Ted Kennedy was opposed to Murdoch's viewpoints, forced him under the law of the Communications Act of 1934 to not be able to own a TV station and a newspaper in the same market. While Murdoch owned one in Boston and one in New York, and Kennedy wanted him to be forced to sell it. So it was a major drama that occurred from 1988 to 1993, and it opened the door for the reforms once Murdoch was able to get back the Post and get a permanent waiver to own both the TV station and the radio and the newspaper. That opened the door to the reforms of 1996 in the Telecommunications Act. The results of the oral history was limited, partially due to the formation of my questions and the subject's preference to answer yes or no to these questions rather than expound. Immediately before turning in this research, I was contacted by the Justice Department lawyer who argued the decision that upheld the right of the FCC to allow to do away with all limits on media ownership of television and newspapers. And he gave me 2 contacts at the FCC's Media Bureau to speak to, but I received them too late for the deadline. I intended on following through with the request to develop the research further. I was also assisted by a lot of information on the FCC website, which has all the orders for the last virtually 50 years. A summary of my conclusions is this. While the bulk of the 1996 Telecommunications Act has been a boon to the development of the internet and has expanded the number of channels, websites, radio stations, television networks, its success or failure cannot be measured in terms of quantity alone. If there are 100,000 outlets and thousands of offerings, as there are today, and they all follow the same parameters of what is considered acceptable thought, set by corporate media conglomerates, many of who own and set those parameters, what public service do they serve for the American people? The marketplace of ideas is just that. It is a marketplace, and consumers will rebel against limitations to what can be said. As sure as night follows day, they will reject those limitations. It's necessary for Congress to revisit the Act for revision at regular intervals instead of leaving decisions to the political winds and the FCC. Moreover, the language needs to be sharper, more well-defined, and clearly state that self-regulation provisions of the CDA in Section 230 can never pertain to political speech, with well-defined exceptions for threats or calls to violence. The Congress should include sanctions in the U.S. Code against any individual or individuals or companies who conspired to stop constitutionally protected nonviolent political speech. Such a revision would ensure that the technology companies are removed from this process, with federal authorities instead tasked to investigate and prosecute real threats, real violent threats, under well-defined legislation. Federal laws against sex trafficking and child pornography in the Act must stay intact. But the Communications Decency Act does nothing tangible to stop the spread of online pornography, or, as you can see today, or to stop it reaching children. In addition, a classification system should be instituted to define a news organization versus an entertainment organization versus opinion programming. At the very least, fines should exist for corporations that misidentify opinion programs as news and vice versa, with clear content rules in which the news describes factual events without opinion. Possibly corporations like CNN, NBC, and Fox would be forced to give the American people what we had as a nation in 1963. 1/2 hour of opinion-free news programming, clearly denoted as such. Addresses by the President of the United States, special reports of national disasters, national events, elections, crises, wars, would also fit under this rubric. The First Amendment can no longer be ceded to a coterie of technology leaders whose loyalties to the United States and the Constitution are clearly suspect. Many of these leaders pay only lip service to the freedoms that allowed them to flourish in the United States, while paying fealty to corporate interests in China and other repressive states. It is the responsibility of Congress under Article 1 to ensure that they step in and redefine it and take them out of the process. And the first step is to revise the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Thank you.